start off here.
Thank you, Dr.
Sure, you're
Diaz.
welcome.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to say a few words and just kick off the discussion, and then I'm going to pass it on to my Sumil and also Melissa to sort of fill in the blanks. And the question becomes, where are we going with pharmaceuticals? So first things first, there's a lot of anxiety within the population when you look at the average population about pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical pricing. Without a doubt, if you look at polls over and over again, one of the things that polls the highest, and it's a bipartisan issue, this is not a partisan thing, that pharmaceutical pricing or cost is a concern. So in the same polls, though, what you notice is that the same percentage of patients also say that they find pharmaceuticals to be affordable for them. So it's 75% say it's a problem, but 75% also say that it's affordable to them. And even when you go down to the level of patients who use multiple drugs for more prescriptions, only about 14% say that they have a difficult time paying for their medicines. So what is going on? And why are we at this situation where there's this differences in opinion in even the individual's mind who is being polled? So the first thing we need to do is really talk about data and where the facts are. And facts are not necessarily going to translate into what patients are feeling, because what patients feel about costs is very different what the society or the healthcare system experiences as cost. For patient, the cost is the most important thing is what they pay at the pharmacy counter. They really care less about what the growth of the healthcare expenditures are, how much are the curves looking like with regards to drug spending, and so on and so forth. So for them, the most important thing is what is going on when they show up at the pharmacy counter and they have to put their hand in their pocketbook and pay for this prescription medicines. The truth is, from a growth perspective, pharmaceuticals are actually growing at a less of a pace compared to other kind of healthcare services in the US, hospitals, healthcare provider services, and everybody else. And this trend has been going on for the last 2-3 years. And even last year, it was growing less than the general inflation in the US, which is unbelievable, right? Because healthcare inflation is generally much larger than overall inflation. So last year, overall inflation was 2.1%. Pharmaceutical growth year over year was 1.5%. So clearly, the growth is not the problem. The growth has subsided. We had the Sovaldi sort of the issue of a few years ago where there was a significant growth because there was pent-up demand for a very serious illness, that there was some curative innovation that came into the market, and now it has subsided. We also know that there's been an explosion of amount of money that goes from pharma companies back to third-party insurers or PBMs and so on. Just to give you an idea, over $125 billion was passed back from pharma companies in form of rebate, concessions, and discounts back to these pharmacy benefit managers, insurers, so-called middlemen. So the question becomes that Sumil is going to talk about, what happens to this drug and how does that patient benefit from that discount and rebate instead of the middleman? Just to give you guys an idea, for every dollar that Pfizer spends or sells, 41 cents goes to that middleman. So we only profit, when we price a pill for $1, we only get 59 cents back. The other 41 cents goes somewhere else. So the out-of-pocket cost issue is also important to note, because if you look at the trends, this is where data becomes really difficult, and you really see what is going on and what are the solutions that Sumil will talk about, and a couple of them that I'll bring up. So when you look at out-of-pocket costs, as a percentage of what patients pay, actual out-of-pocket costs have been going down over time for all of healthcare, not just pharmaceuticals. Patients pay less as a percentage out-of-pocket today than they were paying 5, 10, 15 years ago. And that's just because we have more insurance coverage, right? Think about it. Part D, which is the Medicare benefit program for prescription drugs, only came about in 2006. Prior to that, seniors were paying cash for their pharmaceuticals. So Better insurance coverage, better coverage, broader coverage has happened, that has caused that phenomenon. The second thing that has caused the phenomenon is really the genericizing of the market. 9 out of 10 prescriptions now in the US are of a generic formulation. So patients automatically are paying less, and there's a generic deflation going on in the US from a pricing standpoint. And you could see it in pharma companies who are basically closing out or going away because there's so much competition in the market, Teva being one of them. You know, they've had to relieve a lot of their field force just because the sales aren't there. So patients are paying less, but the problem is that even though the general average person is doing okay from out-of-pocket cost perspective, we still hear stories about patients being bankrupted for out-of-pocket costs. So why is that, and what does that patient look like, and how can we help that individual? So I always tell people, it's not a big issue, because in the US, around 0.2% of the US population spends $50,000 or more in prescription drugs annually, 0.2%. We need to figure out who those patients are that are suffering from this and then put on policies that are going to help those individuals. Meanwhile, there are other policies such as clawback that you may have heard about that really artificially inflate out-of-pocket costs for patients. So what is clawback? Clawback is when you show up as a patient to a pharmacy and you have a $20 copay and you pay your copay, but the real cost to the pharmacist to fill that prescription is $10. So the pharmacist doesn't keep the spread. When you pay 20 and their cost is 10, they don't keep the spread. That spread is then clawed back by the insurer or the PBM back to them as a profit. So in other words, patients are overpaying by using their insurance card, which is never should happen. So the issue was always like, so how often does this really happen? You know, how often does clawback really happen? The initial thoughts were like maybe 10%, which is significant because that means 1 out of 10 times a patient pays for a prescription using their insurance card, they're overpaying for it for no other reason than because the insurance company is profiting from it or the PBM is profiting from it. The study that just came out 2 weeks ago from Schaeffer Institute basically quantified that. They looked at a database from 2013, and they found out 23% of prescriptions actually happen to have a clawback built into them. Not a lot of money, but 23%. That means 1 out of 4 times a patient walks into a pharmacy, they're overpaying for their medicine. That in fact, if they would have paid for cash, it would have been cheaper. So the issue becomes, okay, so this is a generic issue or is it a brand name issue? Well, 28% of the time in the generics, patients overpay, 8% of the time in the brand name drugs. So it's not just a generic issue, it happens in brand name market too. And then the question becomes okay, so if they do, how much are we talking about? Well, in this cohort of the study that they looked at in the research, patients overpaid by $135 million. Just that one study population. This is not the entire country, everybody that happens to them. So basically, if you think about it, $135 million was overpaid by patients for no other reason than this system that was set up by the PBMs and insurers to profiteer from them. Even though, as a patient, you can imagine you walk into a pharmacy or a physician's office or a hospital, your assumption is that you're going to pay the lowest amount because that's who basically somebody's negotiating on your behalf and protecting your rights. But that is not taking place. So those are some of the things that we need to talk about. And then, most importantly, I want to go back to the clinical trial issue because that was mentioned. Innovation is the key here. And we need to innovate in the drug side. We need to also innovate on the payment side. So the issue becomes, are we going to a different model of innovation? Absolutely. You know, we're looking much more precision type medicines, which have fewer patients within them. It affects fewer patients, therefore we need better representation of the minority patients in these studies, Because some of these disease areas, like we do, we have a sickle cell trial at Pfizer. It's all for minorities. So we need better participation. We had a very difficult time filling our clinical trial in sickle cell. Patients just weren't enrolling. And I'm talking about both African Americans and Latino patients who weren't willing to enroll in these clinical trials. So we need to do a better job. But we also have to innovate our practices because frankly, not only we're gonna be paid differently as pharma companies because we're gonna have to take on more risk with regards to risk-based contracting, whether you wanna call it outcomes-based contracting or value-based pricing or whatever it is, so are you as healthcare professionals. The healthcare system is gonna be paid differently. We're moving away from a fee-for-service model to whether you wanna call it capitation, pay for performance, or whatever it is, it's gonna be different. And how do we make sure that we also are successful in this model of payment, because we need to get paid differently to be able to innovate further. You guys need to get paid, you're going to be paid differently, but you need to be in existence to serve your populations or patients. How do we succeed? In my opinion, the one major point that we need to do, all of us working together, is data. Compilation of data is going to be key, because that's what's going to drive us to be able to do some of these clinical trials which are much more smaller, and you already see the signals from the FDA about doing trials differently than just RCTs, randomized clinical trials, rather than doing it in real-world evidence. So we're going to need data for that, but you guys are going to need the data to be able to take on this risk that's coming to you. And you own the data as healthcare professionals. Don't forget that. Nobody else does. And we need to figure out a way for us to be able to work with you directly to capture that information, to be able to then utilize it either for innovation on the pharma side or innovation on the payment reform side. So with that said, I'm going to stop. I'm going to turn it over to Sunil to talk about some of the work that he's been doing.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here today.